It's the morning of November 7th, 1940. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge, spanning the strait between Tacoma and the Kitsap Peninsula in Washington state, is a little over 4 months old. It already has a nickname, Galloping Gertie. Since the day it opened, the deck has rolled and dipped under almost any breeze, gently enough that people drive out from town just to feel it move. This morning is different. The wind is a steady 38 to 42 miles per hour, not a storm, but the bridge isn't rolling anymore. It's twisting. One edge of the roadway climbs while the other drops, and the angle between them gets sharper with every cycle. A newspaper editor named Leonard Coatsworth is partway across when he loses control of his car. He gets out to try to reach the only other passenger, his daughter's dog, a cocker spaniel named Tubby, but is thrown to the roadway before he can get back to it. Too injured to stand, he crawls on his hands and knees roughly 500 yards to solid ground. Minutes later, the center span tears itself apart and drops into the water below. Tubby goes down with the car. He is the only casualty of the entire collapse. Nobody else dies that day, but a brand new suspension bridge, the third longest in the world at the time it opened, has just failed in broad daylight, on film, shot by two local camera shop owners, Barney Elliott and Harbine Monroe, for a reason its own engineers had spent 4 months insisting wasn't dangerous at all. And here's the part almost nobody gets right afterward. Everyone who's heard of Galloping Gertie has heard the same one-line explanation. The wind matched the bridge's natural frequency and shook it apart, the way an opera singer's note can shatter a glass. That explanation is nearly a century old. It's still what most casual retellings repeat. And it is not, in fact, what the bridge's own investigators actually concluded happened. What really brought it down is stranger than resonance, and worth reconstructing properly. Rewind. The Tacoma Narrows is a strait about a mile wide, and before this bridge, crossing it meant a ferry. Washington state wants a car bridge, and in the tail end of the Depression, that means federal money, a grant from the Public Works Administration, and a loan from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, arranged together with a hard ceiling of $4 million on what the project could actually spend. The Washington State Highway Department's own bridge engineer, Clark Eldridge, draws up a first design the conventional way, a suspension bridge stiffened by deep trusses running the length of the deck, around 25 feet deep, the same heavy, rigid approach used on the big suspension bridges of the era. It's a safe design. It's also too expensive for the money available. So the project brings in Leon Moisseff, one of the most respected suspension bridge engineers alive at the time, with major spans already to his name, among them the Manhattan Bridge, and a consulting role on the Golden Gate Bridge. Moisseff proposes cutting the cost by building thinner. His approach, called deflection theory, argues that a suspension bridge's own cables do more of the structural work than the old rulebook assumed, so the stiffening truss can be radically shallower without failing under normal weight. His redesign brings the deck down to roughly 8 feet deep, about a third of Eldridge's depth, at a fraction of the cost. And, as a side effect, nobody was pricing in a much sleeker, more slender profile than any suspension bridge built before it. On paper, it's a good decision. Deflection theory had already worked on some of the largest bridges in the country. Every calculation anyone thought to run, for weight, for static load, checks out. What nobody checks, because almost nobody in the profession is checking it yet anywhere in the world, is what a long, slender, flexible deck does in wind over time, as opposed to under a single gust. The bridge opens on July 1st, 1940. Within days, the deck is visibly moving in ordinary wind, not swaying side to side, but rolling vertically, like a slow ocean swell running down the roadway. The nickname arrives almost as fast as the motion does. And the engineers who built it, watching the same thing everyone else is watching, call it a curiosity. Uncomfortable maybe, but not dangerous. They are about to spend the next 4 months finding out how wrong that assessment was. A University of Washington engineering professor, Frederick Burt Farquharson, starts formally studying the bridge's motion almost as soon as it opens. He and his team measure the oscillation across different wind conditions for months, and they recommend real fixes, vents cut into the girders to let wind pass through instead of pushing against a solid wall, cables added to tie the deck down and damp the motion. The state approves some of that work. It hasn't been finished by November. So, what was actually happening if it wasn't simple resonance? Resonance, in the popular version, needs the wind itself to pulse at exactly the bridge's own natural frequency, like pushing a swing at just the right moment over and over. That's not what a steady wind does. What was actually happening, reconstructed properly by a 1991 physics paper re-examining the bridge's known behavior through aerodynamic theory, and understood today as aeroelastic flutter, is closer to this. As wind moves across a long, slender, solid deck shape like this one, the deck's own movement changes the airflow around it, and that changed airflow, in turn, feeds more energy back into the deck's movement, cycle after cycle. Instead of the air resisting the motion the way it normally would on a stiffer structure, it's adding to it. Engineers call this negative damping. The wind isn't matching a note. It's turning the bridge's own flexibility into a self-feeding engine of motion. It only needed a steady wind and the wrong deck shape. It never needed a lucky frequency at all. On the morning of November 7th, that steady 38 to 42 mile-an-hour wind is producing the same vertical rolling the bridge had shown for months. Then something changes. A cable band clamp on the north main cable near the center of the span slips, and the motion stops being symmetrical. Instead of both edges of the roadway rising and falling together, they start moving opposite each other. One edge up while the other drops. A twisting, torsional wave instead of a rolling one. Torsional flutter is far more dangerous than the vertical rolling the bridge had lived with for months, because it concentrates enormous stress exactly where the deck meets the cables and towers, and once it takes hold, it escalates fast. Within roughly an hour, the twisting grows from the bridge's familiar curiosity into a motion violent enough that the two edges of the roadway are reported moving as much as 28 feet out of alignment from each other, a distortion that sounds almost too extreme for a solid concrete and steel deck to survive even a few cycles of, but it's documented on film from multiple angles and matches the instrument readings Farquharson's team had been logging for months. Picture the two edges of a football field tilting against each other, opposite ends several body lengths out of level, over and over, faster each time. The deck can't take it. A suspender or a section of the floor system finally gives way under the twisting, and the center span drops into the water below in stages, over several minutes, the same collapse the cold open opened on, now fully explained. It becomes some of the most closely studied film footage in the history of structural engineering, still shown in engineering classrooms today. This is worth being precise about, because it's easy to flatten into a simple villain, and the real story is more useful than that. Leon Moisseiff's slender, cost-driven redesign is the direct engineering cause, a deck built without any real accounting for what wind does to a flexible structure over time. But that blind spot wasn't unique to him. A federal board of inquiry convened after the collapse. Othmar Ammann, Theodore von Karman, and Glenn Woodruff, and its own finding was that aerodynamic behavior simply wasn't part of standard suspension bridge practice anywhere at the time. Nobody in the field was wind tunnel testing a bridge deck before this one fell. In that sense, the failure exposed a gap in an entire profession's knowledge, not one engineer's individual error. What is fair to name plainly? The Washington State Toll Bridge Authority, under federal financing constraints, chose Leon Moisseiff's cheaper, slimmer design over the state engineer's costlier, deeper one. For the 4 months the bridge stood, its visible motion was studied and fought, not ignored. Engineers installed hydraulic buffers and tie-down cables and commissioned Farquharson's wind tunnel study, but every fix proved inadequate, and the wind deflectors that might have stopped it were still only on order when the deck tore itself apart on a Thursday morning. There is no victim to protect or anonymize here in the usual sense. The only life lost that morning belonged to a dog, not a person. But it's still worth saying plainly. An almost new bridge, built to carry ordinary commuters across ordinary water, failed in under an hour on a morning like any other, because of a decision made about cost years before any of them ever drove across it. November 7th, 1940. A 4-month-old bridge, already famous for the way it moved, finally moves too far. Leonard Coatsworth crawls off the deck on his hands and knees. Tubby doesn't make it. The center span drops into the Narrows in front of a rolling camera, and within an hour, one of the longest bridges in the world is gone. It wasn't a freak coincidence of wind hitting exactly the right note. It was an entire branch of engineering that hadn't yet learned to ask what wind does to a flexible structure over time, and the one man who was asking, Frederick Farquharson, ran out of time to finish answering it by about 4 months. The investigation that followed didn't just close the file on one bridge. Wind tunnel testing of scale models became standard practice for every major suspension bridge built afterward. A second bridge went up across the same strait in 1950, built with open trusses instead of solid girders, tested in a wind tunnel before a single cable was strung, and it's still carrying traffic today. The original span never left the water. It's still down there, in the Narrows, now home to an artificial reef, listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and the bridge itself later named a National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark by the American Society of Civil Engineers. The lesson wasn't really about one bridge or even one dog. It was about how much a profession can get exactly right on paper and still not know what it doesn't know. Structural failure tells one collapse at a time, from the investigation records and the engineering behind them. Subscribe for the next one.